For 50 years, the silence of Empress Varali was the subject of countless rumors across the galaxy. Some said she had chosen silence as a form of meditation, seeking peace after a long and bloody reign. Others whispered it was a punishment for her people's failures, or perhaps a sign of deep grief that no one truly understood. Her silence was not just an act, it was a force, a presence that hung over the entire empire, a quiet that demanded attention without speaking a word. Varali ruled over a vast alien empire, a civilization that spanned star systems and worlds. Her power was unmatched, her wisdom beyond that of any ruler before her. She had seen the galaxy through times of prosperity and times of conflict. Her reign, though long, had been marked by unshakable authority. No one questioned her. No one dared. But then, without warning, she chose silence. For years, no one heard her voice, not a word escaped her lips. Her advisors and officials communicated with her through gestures, symbols, and silent understandings. The empire carried on, though the silence affected everyone. The people began to wonder, why had their empress, the very heartbeat of their empire, gone quiet? It was at the height of this silence that the human diplomat, Ethan Moore, found himself on the way to the alien capital. His mission was one of importance, to establish a treaty between humanity and the alien empire. The human race had only recently made contact with the empire, and the leaders of Earth saw this as an opportunity to secure humanity's future. The galaxy was vast, and humanity's place in it was uncertain. To ensure their survival, they needed allies. And Varale's empire, though shrouded in mystery, was the strongest force in the galaxy. Ethan had heard the rumors of Varale's silence, but he could never have imagined the truth of it. He had read reports, spoken with experts, but nothing could prepare him for what he would find upon his arrival. As his ship descended toward the capital city of the alien world, he felt a weight settle in his chest. He had never been this far from Earth, never encountered anything quite like what lay ahead. The capital was unlike anything Ethan had seen before. The city was built upon a series of towering spires that seemed to pierce the sky, each one a monument to the alien species' advanced technology and artistry. The streets were lined with statues, intricately designed and elegantly crafted. There were no bustling crowds or busy marketplaces. The streets were eerily empty, save for a few figures moving about silently, as if the entire city had learned to live in the quiet that their empress had imposed. As Ethan made his way to the palace, his mind raced with questions. What could have driven a leader to silence for so long? Was it grief, as some suggested? Or perhaps something deeper, something no one had yet uncovered? The answers felt just out of reach, like a puzzle with too many pieces missing. But he was here for one reason: to uncover the truth and negotiate a treaty that would benefit Earth. The palace was just as silent as the rest of the city. The grand halls were vast, with high ceilings and ornate carvings, but the air felt cold, almost unwelcoming. The guards that stood at attention did not speak, did not acknowledge his presence, as if his arrival was just another part of the routine. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger than he could understand. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan was ushered into a chamber, a vast, circular room with a high ceiling. At the center of the room sat Varali, her figure silhouetted against the soft glow of light streaming from the ceiling. She was seated on a throne made of dark metal, her posture straight and regal. She wore robes of intricate design, but there was nothing grandiose about her appearance. There was a quiet elegance to her, a strength that radiated from her, even in her silence. Ethan stood before her, unsure of what to do. He had been told she would not speak, that she had not spoken in years. But it was one thing to hear about it, and another to experience it firsthand. He took a deep breath and cleared his throat. "Your Excellency," he began, his voice a little more strained than he intended. "I am Ethan Moore, a diplomat from Earth. I come in peace, seeking a treaty between our worlds." Vareli did not respond, her eyes remaining closed as though she were in deep thought. There was no sign of acknowledgement, no movement, not even a glance in his direction. The silence hung heavy in the air. Ethan waited, unsure of how to proceed. He had studied the reports, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Varley's eyes opened slowly. They were deep, dark eyes, the color of a stormy night sky. They focused on Ethan, but there was no warmth, no indication of recognition, just emptiness. Ethan could feel the weight of her gaze, as if she were seeing straight through him. "Why do you seek us out?" Her mind spoke to his, though no words passed her lips. It was not a voice, but a presence, a feeling that entered his mind. Her thoughts were direct, cold, and sharp. Ethan had been briefed on the telepathic abilities of the aliens, but experiencing it firsthand was unsettling. He could hear her thoughts, not in words, but as an overwhelming presence in his mind. He paused for a moment, trying to gather himself. "We come with an offer," he said, his voice steady. "We seek an alliance. Earth is just beginning to expand into the galaxy, and we need the strength of your empire to ensure our survival. We've seen your power, and we want to forge a future together." Vareli's eyes never left him. She studied him, her gaze unwavering. The silence returned, and the room seemed to grow colder. "You do not understand." Her thoughts entered his mind again, this time tinged with something like sorrow. "The galaxy does not need more power. It needs peace." Ethan furrowed his brow, confused. "But isn't power necessary to protect peace? Surely you understand that."
"The galaxy is full of dangers. We need allies to survive."
Varley did not respond. Her mind withdrew, leaving him in a sea of silence once more. Ethan stood there, unsure of how to proceed. The silence felt oppressive now, as though he were drowning in it, but he could not leave. Not yet. He had a job to do, and this meeting was only the beginning. For several days, Ethan remained in the palace, meeting with various officials and advisors. He learned that Vareli's silence was not just a personal choice, but a state of affairs that affected the entire empire. Her people, the ones who had once spoken with her, now communicated through intricate gestures, through written symbols, through silent understanding. Her silence was part of the very fabric of their society, something they had learned to live with, something they had come to accept. Yet, no one could explain why. No one knew what had caused the Empress to shut herself off from the world. Was it grief, as the rumors suggested, or something more? Ethan could sense that the answers were just out of reach, that something deeper was at play. The days passed in quiet contemplation. Ethan grew restless, his questions only growing stronger. He needed to know the truth. He needed to understand what had happened to this once great leader, this woman who held the fate of an entire empire in her hands. What had broken her? What had led her to the silence? One evening, as Ethan walked through the palace gardens, deep in thought, he saw something strange. A figure stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching him from the shadows. It was Vareli, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She was not speaking, but her presence was unmistakable. Ethan approached cautiously.
"Your Excellency," he called out, his voice tentative. Varale turned her head, her eyes meeting his.
And for the first time, there was something in them. A flicker of recognition. A hint of something. Was it fear? Regret? Anger? It was gone in an instant, but it left Ethan with a sense that he was about to uncover something monumental. "Tomorrow," she spoke in his mind once more, "you will ask the question that will change everything." Ethan Moore could not sleep that night. The quiet of the palace was more unsettling than the silence of the Empress. It was not the peaceful kind of quiet, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to press against his chest. The stone walls felt like they were closing in, and the empty corridors stretched on endlessly. Every corner, every shadow, seemed to whisper of something long forgotten. He had learned much during his time in the alien capital. The people of this empire were kind, though their eyes were always weary, always searching. They had lived under Vareli's rule for generations, and though her silence was hard to understand, it was a part of their world. The palace itself was an ancient structure, built from stones that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, their cold surfaces, a reminder of time's unyielding march. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the high windows, Ethan found himself walking again through the palace gardens, seeking some respite from the thoughts that had been swirling in his mind. The garden was tranquil, filled with strange plants and flowers that bloomed in brilliant colors, their petals glistening with the morning dew. It was peaceful, yes, but also strangely still. Even the birds in the trees were silent. There was no song, no chirping, only the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional flutter of wings, and the rhythmic sound of his footsteps. He had barely noticed the figure standing by the fountain, a silhouette framed by the rising sun. The figure was tall and graceful, the flowing robes of the Empress shimmering in the soft light. It was Vareli, her eyes closed, her head tilted slightly as though listening to some far-off sound. She stood still, unmoving, as if caught in a trance. Ethan approached cautiously, the air around him thick with unspoken tension. He had seen her many times before, but this was different. There was something more to her presence today, something more powerful, more mysterious. He felt a strange pull toward her, as though she were both the key to unlocking the mysteries of this empire and the source of its greatest sorrow. "Your Excellency," Ethan said softly, his voice barely rising above a whisper. Varele opened her eyes slowly, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw something change within them. A flicker of emotion, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Her gaze met his, intense and unblinking. There was no warmth in those eyes, only a quiet understanding that stretched across the room, beyond time, beyond words. She did not speak, but her presence seemed to fill the space around them, overwhelming in its silence. Ethan felt the weight of it, the burden of it, pressing on him like 1,000 unspoken thoughts. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, trying to steady his breath, "about the silence, about everything. You've ruled for so long, and yet for 50 years you've chosen to remain silent. Why?" Barali did not respond. She stood there, unmoving, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. Ethan felt the moment stretch into eternity. He wanted to say more, to ask questions, to demand answers, but something inside him held back. He had come to this place seeking a treaty, seeking peace. But what was peace, if it could not be understood? What kind of peace could exist under a silence so deep? As if sensing his frustration, Vareli lifted a hand, and with a single gesture, she beckoned him closer. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. The garden was still, but he could feel the tension rising, a silent storm building just beneath the surface. He was standing on the edge of something vast, something profound. Vareli's eyes softened slightly, though the distance between them remained. The silence, Ethan realized, was not something forced upon her. It was something she had chosen. There was a reason for it, a purpose that went beyond what he could see. "But what was it?" "You've asked the question," she spoke to him, her voice barely a whisper. It was the first time in days that she had spoken, and the sound of her voice sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "And now you will hear the answer." Her words were not spoken aloud, but carried directly into his mind, as though she were placing them there herself. Ethan's heart raced as he tried to process what she was saying. She wasn't just speaking to him, she was speaking into him, her thoughts reaching into the very core of his being. The memories came flooding in, but they weren't his. They were hers. Varali's past unfolded before him like a tapestry, each thread weaving together the story of a ruler burdened with grief, a woman who had once loved and lost, who had ruled over an empire with wisdom and strength, but at great cost. She had once spoken freely, once shared her thoughts and dreams with those closest to her, but something had changed. Something had shattered her world, leaving her to withdraw into herself, a tragedy so great, so overwhelming, that it had driven her to retreat from everything, from her people, from her empire, from herself. The memories came in flashes, bright and painful. Vara Lee had loved a being, someone close to her heart, someone who had shared her vision for the future of the galaxy. Together they had dreamed of a peaceful universe, a place where all species could live in harmony. But it had not been meant to be. Her love had been betrayed. Ethan saw it all, the betrayal so cruel, so sudden, that it left Verily devastated. The person she had trusted, the one she had believed in, had turned against her, and the Empire had been thrown into chaos. She had tried to fight, tried to restore balance, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and the betrayal had left scars that no one could see, scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. It was then that the silence began. Verily had chosen it as a shield, a way to protect herself from the pain. She had vowed never to speak again, never to let anyone in. The weight of her grief was too much to bear, and so she shut herself off, not only from her people, but from the entire galaxy. As the vision faded, Ethan found himself standing before the Empress, her eyes locked on his. Her thoughts, her feelings, had entered his mind and left him shaken. He understood now. He understood the weight she carried, the burden of her silence. He had come to this world seeking an answer, but what he found was far more complicated than he had imagined. "Why did you choose silence?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling with the weight of what he had learned. Varali did not answer. She simply stood there, her expression unreadable. The silence between them felt like a wall now, a barrier that separated them from everything else. Ethan understood that the silence was not just a choice. It was a part of Verily, a part of her soul that she could not escape. The pain of her past had shaped her, had molded her into the ruler she was today, and yet the silence had also isolated her, made her a figure of legend and mystery, but also one of loneliness. He felt pity for her, but he also felt something else, something stronger. He had come to this world seeking an alliance, but what he had found was far more complicated. Varley's silence was not just a personal tragedy. It was a reflection of the galaxy itself, a galaxy full of broken promises and unhealed wounds. But in that moment, Ethan realized something. Silence, no matter how deep, could not last forever. Eventually, the truth would have to be spoken, and when it was, the galaxy would never be the same. Ethan stood still, processing the weight of Verily's memories. The images and emotions were overwhelming, and for a moment, he felt as though the silence between them had grown even heavier. He had come here seeking answers, but what he had uncovered was more than he could have imagined. The Empress, the great ruler who had commanded an entire empire, had been brought to her knees by a single betrayal. Her grief was not just the loss of a loved one. It was the loss of her vision for the galaxy, a vision she had shared with someone she had trusted completely. The silence that had followed was not simply a personal choice. It was her shield. It was the only way she could protect herself from the pain that had threatened to destroy her. She had locked herself away not just from her people, but from herself. And now, here Ethan stood, with the understanding of her pain, but still, no answers. The galaxy's future depended on a fragile peace that seemed almost impossible. The silence between them stretched on. Ethan had asked the question, and now he found himself trapped in it, unsure of how to proceed. The weight of what he had learned weighed on him, and he felt more helpless than he ever had before. But he could not leave without understanding more. He could not leave with this burden on his heart.
Vara!
He spoke softly, his voice breaking the quiet.
Why did you choose to keep this to yourself for so long?
Why did you never let anyone help you? Her eyes, still distant, met his once again. They were unreadable, but in their depths, Ethan could see a flicker of something, a flash of recognition, of longing, perhaps. The silence between them remained, but it no longer felt as oppressive. It felt more like a conversation, one that needed to be had, but had never been possible until now. She lifted her hand, the gesture slow and deliberate. In that moment, Ethan knew that she was preparing to speak, though not with words. Her thoughts reached into his mind, pushing through the silence with a force that was both gentle and overwhelming. Her memories flooded his consciousness again, but this time they were different. This time, they were not just memories of loss. They were memories of a choice.
The silence was never meant to be a punishment, her thoughts began. Not for my people, not for myself. It was meant to protect what was left of me.
When everything I believed in was torn away, when the one person I trusted most betrayed me, I had no choice. I had to shut the world out. Ethan listened in silence, feeling her words in his mind, though they were not spoken aloud. He could hear her sadness, her anger, and the weight of a life that had been shattered in ways no one could understand. She had been strong once, a leader with a vision that extended beyond her own empire. But the betrayal had cut her deeper than any wound ever could. I loved him, she continued. I believed in him. Together, we had a dream of peace. We wanted to unite the galaxy, to bring an end to the endless wars, to build something greater than ourselves. But when the time came to act, when we were on the verge of achieving everything we had dreamed of, he turned away from me. He betrayed me, and with that, he betrayed everything we had worked for. Ethan felt the anger in her words, and for a moment he could almost see her in that moment of betrayal, facing the person she had loved and trusted, only to be left standing alone. The pain was unimaginable, and the depth of her grief cut through him like a knife. But why the silence? Ethan asked, though the question felt unnecessary. He knew the answer, at least in part. He understood the shield she had built around herself, the walls that had kept her from the world. But there was more to this than just grief. There had to be. The silence, she explained, was a way to protect myself. After the betrayal, after the pain. I couldn't speak. I couldn't face the truth, and I couldn't bear to let anyone see how broken I had become. The silence became my way of keeping the world at bay, of making sure that no one could ever hurt me again. I thought that if I remained silent long enough, the pain would fade, but it didn't. Ethan could feel her sorrow, her regret, and the immense weight of her isolation. She had shut herself off from everyone, from everything, because she could not bear to face the world again. She had thought that silence would save her, but all it had done was trap her in her own mind, unable to move forward. Now you ask why, she continued, her thoughts shifting. You ask why I have remained this way for so long. The truth is, I never knew how to break the silence. I thought that if I stayed silent long enough, the hurt would disappear. But it never did. It only grew stronger. Ethan could sense the shift in her emotions. There was no more anger, no more hatred in her thoughts. Now, there was only a deep, aching sadness that seemed to permeate every word she spoke. I was afraid, she whispered, though her voice barely reached his mind. Afraid that if I spoke, if I let anyone in, I would lose everything again. Afraid that my weakness would be exposed. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't bear to face my own failure. Ethan stood quietly, feeling the weight of her confession. He had come here seeking answers, but he had found something far more profound. Varali was not just a ruler. She was a person who had suffered in ways that most could never understand. Her silence was not just a choice. It was a form of self-preservation, a way to keep the world at a distance so that she wouldn't have to face the pain that had torn her apart. You don't have to face it alone, Ethan said quietly, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. You don't have to keep running from the past. I know it's hard. I know you've been hurt, but you don't have to carry that burden anymore. You don't have to carry it in silence. Verily's thoughts were still, but there was something in them now. A shift, a flicker of something new. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there.
I've lived in silence for so long, she said softly, that I've forgotten how to speak.
I've forgotten how to ask for help, how to trust again. But you asked the question. You made me think. Perhaps it's time to let go. Ethan felt his heart quicken. He had spent days trying to understand the Empress, trying to find the answers to the questions that had been gnawing at him. But now, as he stood before her, he realized that the answers were not something that could be given. They were something that had to be discovered, something that only Vareli could find within herself.
You don't have to speak right now,
Ethan said gently. You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to, but you've taken the first step.
You've opened up, even just a little. That's a start.
For the first time, Vareli seemed to relax. Her shoulders, which had been tense and rigid, softened. The air around them, which had been thick with silence and sorrow, now felt a little lighter. It was as though, in this moment, something had shifted within her, a crack in the walls she had built around herself. I've been so afraid, she whispered again. Afraid of what speaking might bring. Afraid of what it might cost me. But now, I don't know what to do. Ethan took a deep breath, unsure of what to say next. He could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of the decision she had to make. It was not something that could be solved with a single conversation, not something that could be fixed overnight. But it was a beginning. It was a chance to heal. Take your time, Ethan said softly.
There's no rush, but remember, you're not alone.
You don't have to carry this on your own.
For a long while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer oppressive, but rather filled with understanding, with the possibility of something new. And as Ethan stood there, watching the Empress, he knew that whatever came next, it would be different. The silence would no longer be her prison. It would be her strength. And somewhere, deep within, Ethan could sense that Vareli was ready to find her voice again. The following days passed slowly, but something had changed. The air felt different now, charged with a quiet energy that had not been present before. Vareli's silence was still there, but it no longer felt like a barrier between her and the world. It was as though the weight of years of unspoken thoughts and emotions had shifted just enough to let a crack of light through. For the first time in a long time, Vareli was beginning to look at the world again. Not as a place of pain, but as a place of possibilities. Ethan could feel it too. The tension that had hung in the palace, the uncertainty of every interaction had loosened. The guards, the officials, even the servants who moved silently through the palace halls seemed to breathe a little easier. The Empire, it seemed, had been waiting for this moment just as much as Vareli had. The Empress still did not speak, but her presence was different now. She no longer sat on her throne, distant and untouchable. Instead, she walked the halls of her palace with a quiet grace, often accompanied by Ethan, who had become her silent companion. They did not speak much, but there was a comfort in their shared silences. Ethan no longer felt the need to fill the gaps with words. He simply walked beside her, observing, learning, understanding. The more time he spent with her, the more he realized that Vareli's silence was not just a result of her grief. It was also a form of resistance. She had resisted the world for so long, afraid that if she spoke, she would lose everything again. But now, there was a quiet willingness in her to face her past, to look at the pain she had hidden from for so long. It was not easy, And there were days when Ethan could see the weight of the world in her eyes. But there were other days, too. Days when she smiled faintly, or when her gaze softened, as if she were beginning to allow herself to heal. One afternoon, as they walked through the palace gardens, the scent of strange, foreign flowers filling the air, Ethan decided to ask her something he had been thinking about for days. "You've said before that you thought silence would protect you," he began, his voice gentle. "But I think it's clear now that it didn't. What will you do now? Will you speak again?" Varali's eyes flickered toward him, and for a moment she looked as though she were considering the question carefully. She did not speak, but the weight of her thoughts was palpable. Ethan could feel the struggle within her, the pull between the safety of silence and the uncertain path that speaking would bring. "I don't know," she finally replied, her voice soft, barely a whisper, but it was enough to make Ethan pause. Her words were not many, but they were heavy. "I don't know if I can. After all this time, I've forgotten what it means to speak, to be heard. I've built walls around myself, and I don't know how to let them fall." Her admission struck Ethan more than he had expected. He had seen her as a ruler, a figure of strength and power, but now he saw her as something else entirely. Someone who had been broken by life and had spent years hiding from that brokenness. "Maybe you don't have to let them fall all at once," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe you can start small." Just a word, then another. "You don't have to face everything at once. You've already taken the hardest step." Varali looked down, her fingers brushing against the soft petals of a flower as she walked. The breeze stirred the air around them, the world carrying on as it always had. But for Verlet, everything felt different now. She had always seen herself as the ruler, the one in control, the one who made decisions for an entire empire. But now, for the first time in years, she was confronting herself, her emotions, her past. She stopped walking and turned to face Ethan. Her expression was more open than he had ever seen it, though still shadowed by the years of silence. She took a deep breath, as though gathering the strength to say something important. "I have spent my life trying to protect myself from the world," she said quietly. "I thought that silence would keep me safe, but what I've learned is that silence doesn't protect you. It isolates you. It builds walls that only get higher and harder to break down." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than he had before. "And now?"
"Now," she said softly, "I don't know if I can ever be the person I once was."
"But maybe that's okay. Maybe I don't have to be her. Maybe I just need to be me," whatever that means. The vulnerability in her words was something that Ethan had not expected, but it struck him deeply. The Empress, the ruler of an entire empire, was speaking about letting go of the identity that had defined her for so long. She was not just letting go of the silence. She was letting go of the persona she had created, the walls she had built around herself to protect her from the pain. "I think that's a good place to start," Ethan said, his voice quiet but full of sincerity. "You don't have to have all the answers right away." "No one does. But you've already come so far." Barley looked at him, and for the first time in years a small, genuine smile crossed her face. It was barely there, but it was enough to make Ethan's heart swell with hope. There was a lightness in her now, a sense of possibility that had been absent before. "I don't know if I'm ready to speak fully," she admitted. "But I think I'm ready to try. Not for anyone else, but for myself." Ethan smiled back at her, feeling a sense of pride for her. And that's enough. Over the next few days, Varley continued to take small steps toward breaking her silence. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she would stop in the middle of a conversation, her thoughts lost in the weight of her past, unsure of how to continue. But each time, she pressed on. She would speak a word, then another, and though her voice was soft and uncertain, it was a sound that had been missing for so long. The Empire watched with bated breath, as their empress began to speak again. It was not a grand return to her former glory. It was more like the first light of dawn after a long night. Slowly, Varalee began to re-enter the world she had once ruled. But this time, there was no mask of perfection, no facade of invulnerability. Varalee spoke from a place of truth, from the rawness of her emotions. Her people could see the change in her, and though they had always respected her, now they respected her more deeply than ever before. They saw her not just as their ruler, but as a human being, someone who had suffered, someone who had struggled, and someone who had come out the other side stronger because of it. It wasn't long before Varalee began to share her story with her people. She told them of the betrayal, of the loss she had endured, and the silence she had chosen as her shield. It was not easy for her, but with each word she spoke, she felt the walls inside her crumble a little more. Ethan remained by her side, watching as the Empress, now more than just a ruler, began to heal. Her voice, once so silent, now filled the halls of the palace with the sound of her truth. The people of the Empire listened with rapt attention, not just because of who she was, but because of what she had become. And as she spoke, Ethan realized something. The silence that had once seemed so oppressive, so impenetrable, was now the thing that had made her who she was. The silence had not been a weakness. It had been her strength, her way of surviving. But now that she had found her voice again, she would not hide from the world any longer. She would face it, speak her truth, and lead her people, not from behind walls, but from the heart. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Varalee no longer felt afraid. She had spoken, and in doing so, she had begun to heal. And so, in the quiet of the palace, in the stillness of the Empire, a new chapter began. One where silence no longer held power over the Empress, and where the future of the galaxy would be shaped not by the fear of betrayal, but by the strength of a woman who had finally found her voice.